topics would likely be discussed. Well, we will try to reconnect with Scott much later. Internet's acting up today. So other news now. Australia has announced that the search for the missing Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 will focus on the southern part of the search area in the Indian Ocean. Officials also disclosed that further refinements of satellite data found on the plane may have turned south earlier than thought. The announcement came as Australia and Malaysia signed an agreement on the search's next phase, which will see the two countries sharing costs. The Beijing-bound plane disappeared on March 8th with 239 people on board. Based on analysis of satellite data, it's believed to have ended its journey in seas far west of the Australian city of Perth. Investigators do not know what happened to the flight, and findings in its black box recorders are seen to be key to understanding the factors behind the disappearance. We move on to other stories now. Following recent activity found near Pt.2 volcano, scientists in Iceland are examining several cauldrons found near the volcano, which could potentially be a sign of an eruption. The cauldrons, depressions in the volcano's surface, each between 10 to 15 meters deep and a kilometer wide, were seen during a flight yesterday. Iceland's Met Office said they were formed as a result of melting, possibly by a subglacial eruption. Pt.2 volcano has been hit by several recent tremors. The area experienced a magnitude 5.7 earthquake on Tuesday, and experts attribute the earthquakes to magma flows beneath the ground, cracking the rocks as it moves. The Met Office has kept its aviation warning level, indicating the potential threat of a volcanic activity to air travel at orange. That's its second highest level. Well, we come back after the break on The World Today, just as we were heaving a sigh of relief that Nigeria has finally dealt with the Ebola virus disease. New cases found in Port Harcourt. Please join us again. Welcome back to The World Today. Just before we delve into our Africa stories, we've reconnected with Scott Stearns, who's at the U.S. State Department. He'll be talking to us about the recent claims by the UN that ISIS militants are guilty of committing executing dozens of Syrian soldiers in Syria. Scott, thank you for staying with us. We do hope you will stay with us, or that technology will help you stay with us on The World Today. There's a meeting between the President with the National Security Team today. What's likely to be the focus of their discussion? Do you know?
Yes, President Obama will be meeting with his national security team in the White House Situation Room. And about 3 hours from now, Secretary of State John Kerry will be joining that conversation by video remote. They'll be looking at some of the surveillance that they've been able to attribute to the situation of the Islamic State on the ground in Syria, as well as the state of the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq. Now, you know, the United States has been far more active in fighting the ISIS fighters inside Iraq by having targeted airstrikes, especially around Mosul, to support the Kurdish Peshmerga forces as they try to drive back the Islamic State. But increasingly, we're hearing from U.S. defense officials that that will not be enough. There will need to be both a reconstituted Iraqi army under the new government in Baghdad to push those Islamic State fighters back into Syria, but that the problem alone can't be solved until the Islamic State is dealt with inside Syria. And that will require a broader international coalition to go against the Islamic State in Syria. The risk there, of course, is that if you go against the Islamic State in Syria, you end up Bashar al-Assad, against whom the United States is supporting more moderate opposition.
It's interesting that should be discussed, Scott, because Syria had indicated just a few days ago saying that they would be willing to help the U.S. fight IS militants in Syria. Is President Barack Obama considering that option at all?
No, and the U.S. officials are quite clear to state that even though the Assad regime is fighting the Islamic State and the United States is fighting the Islamic State, that does not make the United States an ally with the Assad regime. You did hear from the Syrian Foreign Minister al-Mualim that they were welcoming international support, even the U.S. and the U.K., in the fight against the Islamic State. That would be a big boost for the government in Damascus, and in some way would help legitimize fight against the Syrian opposition that they describe broadly as being terrorists. Now, in their terminology, the terrorists they're fighting are not only Islamics, but also the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian Opposition Coalition that the United States supports. So the Obama administration is very mindful of staying away from the perception that fighting the Islamic State somehow makes them an ally of the Assad regime. But it's inescapable that if you weaken Islamic State positions inside Syria, that will benefit the government in Damascus.
And what about criticism that the president, if President Barack Obama had actively supported the Syrian opposition, well, the U.S. would not be in this position today. There would be no threat of IS militants to the West, either the U.K. or to the United States. Would it have changed anything, you think?
That's a lot of criticism that you're hearing here in Washington, especially from the president's political opponents, that he's not done enough. He's been leading from behind, the opposition party here in the United States likes to say, on Syria. As you'll recall, the United States was within hours of launching airstrikes against Assad forces over the chemical weapons issue before the president came out to the Rose Garden and said, okay, we're going to have a deal where the Syrian government ends up giving up its chemical weapons. It's impossible to say, of course, what would have happened had the president more actively supported the Free Syrian Army with munitions. That would have led to any number of really impossible to predict regional repercussions. There would have been countries that were involved in supporting the Assad regime, namely Russia and Iran, that would no doubt have reacted in some way to more aggressive U.S. arming of the Free Syrian Army. In addition, there are countries that were taking the lead in helping the more moderate opposition, the Saudis, the Qataris, and individuals in those countries helping to arm even more extreme groups inside Syria. President Obama himself dismisses that suggestion, saying that he has taken a measured approach to the conflict in Syria, that America do not want to be involved in a conflict. As you know, this is a leader who was elected and has ruled largely by getting out of conflict, Iraq and Afghanistan, and avoiding conflict, Libya notwithstanding. That dynamic has now changed, especially in the last 6 months, with the rise of the Islamic State crossing the border into Iraq, and in part the execution of the U.S. journalist Jim Foley that the Obama administration has classified as a terrorist act. That may be part of the justification for acting more broadly against the Islamic State and portraying it as a threat to the U.S. homeland.
Thanks a lot, Scott. We do appreciate